One day in August 1881, in the redwood forest outside Eureka, California, a machine appeared that had never existed before. It sat on heavy wooden skids in a clearing between stumps that were 12 feet across. It was not much to look at: an upright wood-burning boiler about the size of a man, a single-cylinder engine bolted to the side, a horizontal spool mounted on a drive shaft, and 150 feet of manila rope 4.5 inches thick wound around the spool. Dolbeir, the man who built it, was 54 years old. He was a partner in the Dolbeir and Carson Lumber Company, one of the largest timber operations in Humboldt County, and he had spent the better part of 2 decades watching ox teams drag logs through the woods at a pace that made him want to put his fist through a wall. A good ox team, 6 to 10 animals hitched in pairs, could move 1 log at a time down a skid road greased with lard. The road had to run downhill. The oxen could not pull uphill. Every skid road started high and ended low, and every log moved by gravity as much as by muscle. It took a full day to drag a single redwood log a 1/4 mile to the landing. Dolbeir lit the fire under his boiler, let the pressure build, opened the throttle, and the spool turned. The rope tightened. A log moved. It was not elegant. The first model was underpowered. The hemp rope stretched when it got wet, and the angles from which you could pull were limited. But the log moved, and it moved without a single ox, and Dolbeir looked at what he had built and understood exactly what it meant. He patented the machine in April 1882 and called it a logging engine. Everyone else called it a steam donkey because the first one looked too small to deserve a proper name. Within 20 years, that small machine would become the most important piece of equipment in the American timber industry, the mechanical heart of every logging operation, from Northern California to the Canadian border. It would drag millions of board feet of Douglas fir, redwood, and spruce out of forests so steep and dense that no animal could work them. It would make possible the logging of terrain that had been considered permanently inaccessible, opening the great coastal forests of Oregon and Washington to industrial-scale harvest for the first time. It would replace every ox and every horse in every major logging camp west of the Cascades, and it would kill the men who operated it in ways that the ox teams had never imagined. If you learn something new from these deep dives into the machines that built and broke the industrial world, subscribing is the single best way to support the channel so we can keep making them. The original Dolbeir's donkey required 3 men, a boy and a horse. The engineer, called the donkey puncher, tended the steam engine and operated the winch. The spool tender stood beside the drum and guided the cable across the spool with a short stick, keeping it from piling up and jamming. The choker setter worked out in the cut timber, sometimes a 1/4 mile from the machine, wrapping a noose of cable around each felled log and hooking it to the main line. When the choker was set, the boy pulled a wire that ran from the choker setter's position back to a steam whistle mounted on the donkey. 1 blast meant, "Go ahead." The donkey puncher opened the throttle, the drum turned, the cable tightened, the choker cinched around the log, and the log began to move. It came crashing and grinding through the stumps, slash and undergrowth toward the machine, dragging everything in its path. When the log reached the landing, it was unhooked, and the horse hauled the cable back out to the choker setter for the next log. That was the system. A rope, a whistle, a boy, and a horse. Within a decade, every part of it had been improved, and every improvement made it faster and more dangerous. The hemp rope was replaced by steel wire cable, which did not stretch, did not rot in the rain, and could pull loads over distances of 1,500 feet instead of 150. The horse was replaced by a second drum called the haulback, which pulled the main line back out to the woods mechanically, turning the whole operation into a continuous loop of steel cable cycling through the forest at speed. The single-cylinder engine was replaced by compound engines with multiple cylinders driving multiple drums, machines so powerful they could drag a log weighing 20 tons through a quarter-mile of standing timber and across terrain that would have killed a team of oxen in the first 50 feet. By the 1890s, the steam donkey had evolved from Dolbeir's modest spool and rope contraption into an industrial weapon. The big Willamette and Washington and Tacoma models weighed 15 to 20 tons. They sat on massive log sleds, bolted down with iron dogs, with the boiler at the rear, a water tank or fuel bunker beside it, and the engine and drums at the front under a crude wooden shelter called the donkey house. The drums held thousands of feet of steel cable. The cable ran out through the brush to wherever the choker setters were working, sometimes threaded through a system of blocks and pulleys strung between stumps and standing trees that could redirect the pull around obstacles and up slopes that no straight drag could manage. When the machine was running, the noise was enormous. The exhaust stack coughed black smoke, the boiler hissed, the drums screamed as the cable wound in underload, and the whole sled shuddered and groaned against the logs it sat on. The whistle code blew constantly, short and long blasts that told the donkey puncher what was happening 1,000 feet away in the brush where he could not see. One short blast, stop. Two short blasts, go ahead on the main line. Three short blasts, go ahead on the haulback. The men working the cable end of the operation communicated with the donkey puncher entirely through the whistle, because in a forest full of standing timber, downed logs, and slash piled 6 feet deep, you could not see the machine and the machine could not see you. The boy who pulled the whistle wire was called the whistle punk. He stood between the choker setters and the donkey, positioned where he could see both, and he was the only link between the men setting chokers in the brush and the engineer running the drums. If the whistle punk missed a signal or pulled the wrong code, the donkey puncher made the wrong move, and the cable did something nobody expected. That was when men died. The cable was the primary killer. Steel wire rope under tension stores enormous energy. A cable pulling a 20-ton log up a hillside is not a static line. It is a spring loaded with thousands of pounds of force, and when it fails, when a choker slips or a shackle breaks or the cable itself parts at a worn spot, it does not simply fall to the ground. It snaps back. A 1-inch steel cable under working load that breaks or comes free releases its stored energy instantaneously. The severed end whips through the air at a speed and with a force that can cut a man in half. This is not a figure of speech. Loggers called it getting caught in the bite of the line, meaning standing anywhere within the arc that a snapping cable could reach. And the stories that came out of the camps about what a cable could do to the human butt were the reason experienced loggers flinched every time a line went taut. The choker setters worked in the most exposed position. They were the men on the ground in the brush, crouching beside logs, wrapping the heavy steel choker around timber, while the main line lay on the ground nearby, slack but ready to come tight the instant the whistle blew. They had to hook the choker to the main line, signal the whistle punk, and then get clear before the cable tightened and the log began to move. Getting clear meant moving far enough away that if the log swung, if a choker slipped and the log rolled, if the cable snagged on a stump and the log changed direction, they were outside the killing radius. The killing radius was the length of the longest log in the turn plus the length of the choker plus any deflection in the cable plus whatever margin of safety a man thought he needed. In a forest floor covered in slash and downed timber and tangled brush, moving quickly was not always possible. Men tripped, men misjudged, men thought they were clear and they were not. When a log came through the brush under thousands of pounds of cable tension, it did not follow a predictable path. It caught on stumps and swung sideways. It rode up over obstacles and launched into the air. It upended when the choker was set too close to one end, and the heavy end dropped and the light end rose, and the log became a 20-foot lever swinging through space. Choker setters were struck by logs they thought were moving away from them. They were crushed by logs that changed direction when they hit an obstacle. They were killed by unchoked logs that the turn picked up and carried along as loose debris, logs that no one had accounted for, logs that came through the brush like battering rams alongside the ones that were supposed to be moving. Then there was the ground lead problem. In the early years before high lead yarding was developed, every log was dragged along the ground from the stump to the landing. Ground lead meant the log was in contact with the earth the entire way, plowing through soil and slash and stumps at the end of a cable being wound in by a donkey engine that could not see what the log was doing. When a ground lead log hit an obstacle, one of several things happened. The cable tension increased until the obstacle gave way, and the log lurched forward with a violent jerk that could snap a choker or part the cable. Or the log rode up over the obstacle and became airborne for a moment before crashing back down. Or the log swung to one side around the obstacle and swept through whatever was in the new path. Ground lead logging destroyed the forest floor. It tore up soil, ripped out roots, gouged channels in the hillside, and left behind a landscape that looked like it had been shelled. It also left behind slash, the branches and broken tops and bark and debris that accumulated at every landing and along every drag path, and that slash was the second way the steam donkey killed. The machine burned wood. In the coastal forests of the Pacific Northwest, the cheapest and most abundant fuel was the slash itself, the waste timber that surrounded every operation. Donkey engines threw sparks from their smokestacks constantly. In 1913, the Washington Forest Fire Association began inspecting logging camps and found nearly 1,500 donkey engines operating in western Washington alone, and not one of them had an effective means of preventing sparks from escaping. Loggers were supposed to put screens on the smokestacks. Some did, many did not. The screens clogged with soot and reduced draft and slowed the operation, and time was money and money was board feet, and board feet did not wait for a man to clean a spark screen. So the sparks flew, and they landed on slash that was sometimes 6 feet deep and tinder dry, and the slash burned, and the fire spread. And when it spread into standing timber in the dry season, there was nothing between the fire and the horizon. In September 1902, fires in southwest Washington burned 370 square miles of timber and killed 38 people. They called it the Yacolt Burn, the worst fire in Washington history to that point. Loggers burning slash, sparks from logging equipment, and a summer so dry the forest floor crackled underfoot. No organized firefighting existed. People fled. Some did not flee fast enough. In August 1933, a logging crew working the slopes above the North Fork of Gales Creek in the Oregon Coast Range dragged one final log through the brush before shutting down for the day. A steel cable dragging a Douglas fir across a downed snag generated a spark, or hot embers escaped from the firebox of the steam donkey and ignited nearby slash. The exact cause was disputed for decades. What was not disputed was the result. The Tillamook burn consumed 350,000 acres of old-growth forest, timber that had been 400 years in the making, destroyed in a few seething days. The smoke column rose 8 miles into the sky. Ash fell on ships 500 miles at sea. Over 10 billion board feet of timber were lost, more than twice what Mount St. Helens would destroy nearly 50 years later. And the fire came back. In 1939, in 1945, in 1951, fires returned to the same ground, burning through the dead standing timber left by the previous burn, each fire primed by the one before it. In 18 years, 355,000 acres of the richest timberland on the continent burned and reburned until there was nothing left but ghostly gray snags standing against the sky in rows that went on for miles. In September 1918, a spark from a donkey engine near Lindbergh in Lewis County, Washington, started a fire that destroyed 84 million feet of standing timber and burned the town itself off the map. That was one spark from one donkey engine on one afternoon. Multiply that by 1,500 machines running every dry season across western Washington alone, and you begin to understand the scale of what the steam donkey did to the forest that fed it. If these stories about the real human cost of the machines that built the industrial world are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss the next one. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm to keep showing these to people who care about this history. But the donkey's most lethal evolution was not ground-lead yarding, it was what came after. Around 1904, loggers began running the mainline cable through a block mounted high on a tall tree instead of dragging logs along the ground. The tree was called a spar tree, and it changed everything. A spar tree had to be one of the tallest and strongest trees in the cut. A Douglas fir 200 feet high or more, perfectly straight, with a trunk thick enough to absorb the enormous lateral forces that the cable system would impose on it. Before a spar tree could be used, it had to be prepared. That job fell to the high rigger. The high rigger was a man who strapped steel climbing spikes to his boots, looped a wire cord rope around the trunk of the tree, and climbed. He went up 200 feet with a short-handled axe, chopping off every branch as he ascended, each cut showering bark and limbs down on the men below. When he reached a point where the trunk narrowed to about 3 feet in diameter, he stopped and cut the top off the tree. This was the most dangerous moment. When the top section, sometimes 30 feet of solid timber weighing several tons, separated from the trunk and fell away, the tree reacted. Released from the weight of its crown, the spar whipped backward and then forward in enormous arcs, swinging the high rigger through the air at the top of a 200-foot pendulum. He held on. If his rope held and his spikes stayed set and the tree did not crack, he rode it out. Then he rigged the blocks, hanging pulleys that weighed hundreds of pounds at the top of the tree, threading the main line and haulback cables through them, and securing the spar with guy wires radiating out to stumps on all sides. When he came down, the spar tree was the center of a web of steel cable reaching out into the forest for a quarter mile in every direction, and every cable ran back to the steam donkey. High-lead yarding was faster, more efficient, and catastrophically more violent than ground lead. Instead of dragging along the earth, logs were now pulled partly or fully through the air, swinging on cables at heights of 50 or 60 feet above the ground, smashing through standing timber, snapping off smaller trees, sending debris in every direction. The forces involved were immense. A log suspended from a cable exerts dynamic loads far greater than its static weight, and when it swings, when it catches on an obstacle and breaks free, when a choker slips and the log drops and the cable rebounds, the energy release is explosive. Logs flew through the air like projectiles. They swung on their chokers in arcs that could not be predicted. They upended and dropped and rolled and shattered against stumps in ways that sent fragments hundreds of feet. And the men were still on the ground in the middle of it, setting chokers and clearing rigging and signaling the donkey puncher through the whistle code, working in a forest that had become an open-air factory, running at industrial speed with no walls, no guards, no safety equipment, and no way to see what was happening more than 50 feet in any direction through the brush and slash and standing timber. The book was called More Deadly Than War, written by Father Andrew Mason Prouty, and it covered Pacific coast logging from 1827 to 1981. The title was not hyperbole. In the peak decades of steam donkey logging, the fatality rate in the Pacific Northwest timber industry exceeded the casualty rate of American soldiers in every war the country had fought. Logging was and remains the deadliest occupation in the United States, with a fatality rate that is 23 times the national average for all workers. In the early 1900s, before any safety regulation existed, the rate was far higher. There were no hard hats. There were no safety lines. There were no kill switches on the donkey drums that a man could reach from the brush. The choker setters worked in caulk boots and wool clothing, and they carried nothing that could protect them from a cable snap or a swinging log or a runaway turn. When a man was killed, and men were killed regularly, the body was carried back to camp. The operation stopped long enough to clear the rigging, and work resumed. The camps were remote. The nearest doctor might be a full day's travel. Men who were injured but not killed often died of infection or shock before medical help arrived. The legal framework of the era gave the men almost nothing. The assumption of risk doctrine, the same legal principle that shielded every other dangerous employer in the country, held that a man who took a logging job had accepted its dangers by taking it. The company owed him nothing when the cable snapped. What the steam donkey built was visible from space. Oregon's annual timber production rose from under 1 billion board feet in the 1880s to over 4 billion by the 1920s, and nearly all of that increase was driven by mechanized cable logging powered by steam donkeys. A single donkey and crew could yard 40,000 to 65,000 board feet per day, with peaks reaching 90,000. That lumber framed the cities of the West Coast. It built San Francisco after the earthquake. It built the shipyards that launched the fleets of 2 world wars. It crossed the Pacific as export timber to markets in China and Japan and Australia. The Douglas fir forests of Oregon and Washington were the single largest source of construction lumber in the world for the first half of the 20th century, and the steam donkey was the machine that got it out of the woods. At the peak, in the 1920s, the sound of donkey whistles could be heard echoing off the hills around timber towns from Eureka to Bellingham. Residents of Reedsport, Oregon, claimed they could distinguish the individual whistles of as many as 40 different donkey engines working the surrounding hillsides, each machine with its own pitch and rhythm, a mechanical chorus that ran from before dawn until dark every working day of the season. The machine moved itself. When a donkey had yarded every log within reach of its cables, it did not wait for a team of horses to drag it to the next setting. The donkey puncher attached the main line to a stump or standing tree in the direction the machine needed to go, opened the throttle, and the donkey winched itself across the ground on its log sled, dragging its own weight over stumps and slash and broken terrain to the next position. It pulled itself uphill. It lowered itself down slopes. It crossed gullies and side hills by rigging cables to anchor points on the far side and hauling itself across. The machine was its own transportation, and it left behind a trail of gouged earth and broken stumps that marked its path through the forest like the track of something enormous and hungry that had eaten everything around it and moved on to find more. John Dolbeir died in San Francisco on August 17, 1902, from a heart ailment. He was 75 years old. His estate was worth nearly $1 million, virtually all of it built on the timber that his machine had made it possible to extract. He did not live to see the high-lead era. He did not live to see the Tillamook burn or the Yakult burn or the transformation of the Pacific Northwest from unbroken old-growth forest into the largest lumber-producing region on Earth. He did not live to see the men who worked the machines he set in motion carried out of the woods on stretchers or wrapped in canvas. He had solved the problem he set out to solve. He had replaced the ox. What the replacement cost was somebody else's accounting. Today, roughly 5,000 steam donkeys remain scattered across the Pacific Northwest in museums and parks and forest clearings where the brush has grown up around them. Some sit on their original log sleds, boilers rusted through, cables coiled in the weeds, donkey houses collapsed into piles of rotting planks. A few have been restored and are fired up for demonstrations once or twice a year at logging heritage events. The whistle blowing, the drum turning, a single log dragged 100 feet across a field while tourists watch from a safe distance. At the Tillamook Forest Center on Highway 6 in Oregon, a steam donkey sits that was abandoned in the woods when the Salmonberry Fire swept through in 1945. The logging crew fled so fast they left everything behind. The bunkhouse cars burned. The mattress springs melted into the forest floor. The donkey survived because it was made of iron. It sat there for 56 years, untouched, rusting in the rain, until a crew of volunteers dismantled it piece by piece and airlifted it out by helicopter in 2001. It is the only piece of equipment that made it out of the woods from that operation. Everything else was consumed. The forest grew back. The men who ran are gone. The machine remains because the machine was always the thing that lasted longest. The men who ran it were always the thing that was easiest to replace. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them has a story the textbooks left out.